Hi, welcome to Veggie 360, where you're going to learn how to grow great tasting veggies year-round in small spaces. I'd like to welcome new gardeners as well as any experienced gardeners who are looking for some new ideas. Today's video is going to be on how to start a fall garden. Fall's a great time to start your garden. The weather is a lot cooler. You don't have to worry about the wicked 100+ degree temperatures. So let's go ahead and do a fall garden. When I first started gardening, I thought it was all about growing the warm weather crops. Tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, basically the summer crops. Then I learned about fall gardening and it opened up a whole new world. With proper planning and timing and providing protection for your crops during the winter using techniques I'm going to cover in later videos, you can actually harvest fresh vegetables from your garden well into the winter and, depending on where you live, year-round. There's several things to consider when putting in a new garden. Most importantly is the location. Where do you want to put it? What type of garden do you want to put in? In-ground, raised bed, or container? For today, we're going to focus specifically on raised beds. How big do you want to build the garden and what materials would you like to use? What would you like to grow? And are you going to need to protect it from wildlife? Now let's go into some details on location. You want sun exposure of a minimum of 6 to 8 hours per day. Look at your property, track it over time for several days to see where it gets the most sun. The minimum is 6 to 8. You can go less than that, but your plants are generally going to be less hardy. They're going to be more leggy. They're going to produce less. So the more sun you can get, the better. Specifically or particularly when you're going to the fall, where the days are going to start getting shorter and shorter as you get toward the winter solstice. Now, in deciding where to put your garden, you also want to think about what types of structures can cast a shade on your garden. For instance, trees. Not only do you have to worry about the canopy for trees, but you also have to think about the root system interfering with the nutrients and the moisture content of the soil. They're going to rob the water. Fences are great because you can trellis up the fence. However, the fence can also cast a shadow or a shade on your garden bed. The house can also cast a shadow. So when we've moved several times, and each time we've done the house hunting, I've looked for houses that have backyard facing the south. You want to orient your beds north to south so that as the sun goes from east to west, it's not shadowing or shading any vegetables that are growing in the beds. Another thing to consider is access to water. Last thing you want to do in the middle of summer when it's 100+ degrees is drag the garden hose out 50 feet across the yard to water and then have to pull the hose back in when it's time to mow. There's solutions. You can dig a trench and run PVC pipe out to the garden and put a hose bib by the garden. That's one solution, but easiest to have it closest to the house. A garden doesn't have to be utilitarian. You can have beauty with bounty by including the right design elements. So place your garden close to the house to make it easier to enjoy the beauty of the garden. Place it close to the back door and it'll make it easier to water and maintain, as well as easier to harvest, which will come in handy in the middle of winter. You'll also want to find an area of your yard that is as flat as possible. For our yard, we ended up bringing in fill dirt and leveling it out in order to build out the garden. That was more expensive than what I was hoping for. In hindsight, I wish that we had terraced the beds. It would have been a lot cheaper. So if you have a sloping property, you can always terrace your beds. Also, you want to avoid waterlogged area. Drainage is going to be an issue. Drainage is something to consider. You also want to think about how big of a garden do you want to put in. Well, that's going to be dictated by what you want to plant and how much do you want to plant. If you're a beginning gardener, I would encourage you to start small. You can always expand later, But the last thing you want to do is to put in a garden that's larger than you're comfortable or able to maintain comfortably. So if you can't maintain it properly, you're going to get discouraged. You're going to say, I can't garden. Don't want to see that happen. Start small. Ideally, you can start with a 4x4 bed, put in 2 4x4 beds, or you can do a 4x6 or 4x8. If you are putting in multiple beds, you're going to need to think about your walkway between the beds. You want your walkways to be at least 2.5 to 3 feet wide. Now, space is very valuable, particularly in smaller gardens, but having the 2.5 to 3 feet wide spacing allows you to work comfortably in the garden, as well as bring in the wheelbarrow for the routine maintenance, like replenishing the soil. It also allows the plants to expand out into the aisle. For instance, your vining crops, like winter squashes and watermelons, it allows them a place to go without eating up valuable space in your beds. Now let's talk about raised bed design. How deep do you want to build your beds? You want a minimum of 6 to 8 inches deep. That way you're covering the root zone. My only caveat to this is if you're doing any root crops such as carrots or potatoes, you're going to want to have 12 inches to give them plenty of room for the roots to develop properly. A popular design now is the deeper beds, 1.5 to 2 feet deep. These taller beds are wonderful. They're great on a bad back because you're going to be stooping over less and it's easier to harvest. The only problem is they're also more expensive to fill. What kind of materials do you want to use for building your beds? Wood is a very common material. Untreated lumber is great, but you're going to have to replace it every 3 to 5 years. We started out with untreated lumber and we replaced ours at 5 years. Now we have cedar, which is more long lasting. It's a beautiful wood, but it's also more expensive than untreated lumber. You can also think about using treated lumber. It's a lot safer than the earlier versions that had arsenic in it. Currently, treated lumber does not contain any arsenic. It does contain a copper compound, but a copper fungicide is what you spray for powder mildew. Another option that's very popular right now is the galvanized corrugated metal sheeting. It's definitely more long-lasting than wood. It looks beautiful. It's more upscale. If you want to go for visually appealing, this is definitely a good way to go. Another option is the galvanized steel containers, like a watering trough you can get at a farm supply store or big box stores. You can also do stone and brick, but that's going to be more expensive. It is much more long-lasting, and it's absolutely gorgeous. The least expensive, though, is simply, and this is how I started gardening, was just build your beds and have sloping edges so that there are no sides to your bed. There's a lot of great ideas on Pinterest or house.com. Some of these ideas are just absolute eye candy. So take a look to get inspired for what you want to build for your garden. Let's talk about building the beds. If the terrain is nice and flat, you're great. You just set your beds on top and make sure all 4 corners are level so that you don't have water running off. However, if you have property that's on a slope, then you need to terrace the beds. Simply just dig in on side, level it out, and make sure the lip on the downhill side is tall enough or far enough out of the ground so that when you have water runoff, it doesn't wash your soil away. Now, if you are building on concrete, like a driveway or a patio, go with the smaller boxes or smaller beds, like a 4x4 or 2x4, and put, or 3x4, and put a wooden base on your bed. I've seen some really cool ones that are on casters so they can roll it around and follow the sun. That's a really cool idea. Now, if you're putting your beds on grass or your lawn, first thing you want to do is to mow it as short as you can. Level your surface, and then put several layers of cardboard, wetting each layer after you put it down. And then you put your soil mix on, and you want to have at least 6 inches deep, preferably 10 inches if possible. If you are going to do the root crops, I would encourage you to do at least some section of it 12 inches deep so that it'll have room for the roots to grow. Now, filling the beds, you have several options. There's lots of recipes available. All you have to do is to Google, and you can find different options. My 2 favorites are topsoil with 30%, 25 to 30% compost mixed in, or what I use in my garden is Mel's Mix. Go to squarefootgardening.org and you can find the recipe that Mel Bartholomew developed, therefore the name Mel's Mix. It contains 1/3 compost from 5 different sources of compost, 1/3 coarse vermiculite, and 1/3 peat moss or cocoa fiber core. For our garden, we used the core because it seemed to hydrate much more readily. It does a great job holding the moisture content in the soil, but then if you get a heavy rain, you've got the vermiculite to help drain the beds. The benefit of having a raised beds, it heats up faster in the winter time, or faster in the spring, but it also drains better. Now, if you have the taller beds, 18 inches deep, that will be more expensive to fill if you want to use all topsoil. So what I suggest is putting old wood or boards in the bottom, and then compost, dried leaves, grass clippings, straw, sources of organic material, in the bottom of the bed. And then the top, keep the top 6 to 10 inches for your premium potting mix, such as Mel's Mix or your topsoil. As the organic material breaks down over time, you will want to backfill. So keep that in mind when you're trying to decide what to fill your lower part of the boxes with. Now let's talk about protecting the beds from wildlife. In our area, deer are a huge problem. When I first started gardening here at this house, I was basically feeding the deer. We tried sprays, discs, all kinds of repellents, didn't work. So we ended up having to literally fence in the yard, or fence in the garden. And as you can see, we have this really cool box, a planter box on top of our fence. So the fence is doing double duty. I'm limited with the space on what I can plant out because I had to put the fence around, and I didn't have to pay a lot of money for a fence. So by putting the planter box on top of the fence, it's actually doing double duty, and I'm getting strawberries planted in this planter box. Can't tell you how many batches of strawberry jam I've made from these. What a great way to use your fence. Now, whether to fence the whole garden or to do individual beds is going to be determined on how many beds you have and what kind of wildlife you're trying to exclude from your garden. I would suggest fencing the whole garden if you have multiple beds or if you have deer problems. Deer are tenacious. They will get into everything, so fence the whole thing. If you're fencing to keep the deer out, you want to fence that at least 6 to 8 feet high. We actually have a fruit tree bed out back behind this garden, and the deer are pretty tenacious and chewed through our plastic deer fence. We bought a high quality deer fence. They chewed right through it, got into my fruit trees and my raspberries. So if you're putting up a fence, I suggest going forward that you do a metal fence to keep the deer out. Again, 6 to 8 feet tall. Now, if you're doing individual beds, I would encourage you to look at squarefootgardening.org. They have some great examples of how to cover individual beds. An easy way to do it is just simply the 1/4 inch PVC pipe created into hoops, and then netting placed on top of that. let's talk about now what to plant in the fall. If you're new to gardening, then you're going to want to go with some of the easier vegetables to grow. I can give you a partial list. This is only a partial list. There's all kinds of veggies that you can plant for fall and winter growing, but these are the easiest. They take up the less space. I would avoid cabbage and cauliflower if you're limited on space, because those are literally space hogs. So for the fall, broccoli, any of your cold hardy leafy greens like your collard greens, mustard greens, kale, kohlrabi, Swiss chard, and spinach. Those are all great options. Even some of the Asian greens like tatsoi or pak choi are good options. Peas are a great option too. You can do sugar snap or snow peas. You can do root crops like carrots, radishes. Oh, radishes, they grow so quickly. You can harvest them in a very short amount of time, so you can get several crops of radishes in the fall. And carrots, so beets, carrots, and radishes are great options for the fall. Salad greens such as your lettuce and your arugula. There's so many different types of lettuces. Pick your lettuces that are going to be more cold hardy though, for putting them in. Now, trying to determine when to plant your garden is going to be dictated by what part of the country you live in. What is the climate in your area? If you're in the US, you look at your agricultural zone. Right here in Virginia where we are, it's agricultural zone 7A. So our first average frost date is October 15th. You can go online, I'll put some links below, go online to look up by zip code what your first frost date is, because this is the date you start counting from. You count back based on the number of days per harvest for each specific variety of vegetable that you're planting. You can look at the back of the seed packet, or if you're buying plant starts at your local nursery or big box store, it tells you how many days to harvest. Now, since this is fall gardening, the days are going to start getting shorter the closer you get toward winter solstice. So you're going to have to actually add a week to that number of days to harvest. You can extend the harvest by using some simple techniques for season extenders. The easiest is simply covering your plants with a sheet when you're expecting a frost. Or you can do agricultural fleece for a row cover. You want to make sure though that if this is going to be a colder night, that the leaves or the tips of your plants are not touching that sheet or agricultural fleece, because they will freeze. So what I like to do is I use I like to use PVC pipes, 1/4 inch PVC pipe bent into a hoop with the agricultural fleece on top. And that creates a nice cozy space to keep the plants protected. Using this technique, and when using that technique, I was able to harvest my vegetables all the way through the winter time, and actually have to pull them up in the spring when it was time to plant. On the colder nights when we did get the hard freezes, I did add a second layer of protection, a second layer of the agricultural fleece to give it a little bit more protection. I even brought in some milk jugs that I filled with hot water on the super cold nights, and that radiant heat that kept the plants warmer. If you live in a very cold climate like zone 5, zone 3, 4, 5 or colder, then you actually can use a cold frame that will give you even better frost protection, and you can grow further into the winter that way compared to just the mini hoop house. So if you learned something today and would like to learn more, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be talking about what to plant in more detail, when to plant, how to build your beds, and more on season extenders. Thank you very much. Goodbye.